All right. Let's introduce yourself for those who might not know who you are.
I'm Chris Pape, also known as Freedom, and known primarily for my work in the Freedom Tunnel.
Okay. Let's start from the beginning. What neighborhood or borough are you from?
I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan back when it was kind of crazy. This is the 60s and 70s, and you had, I mean, back then you had, street gangs, you had politics. I remember when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. I had worked for Robert Kennedy back in '68. I was 8 years old, and they would pay you off in cokes. So you'd stuff like 1,000 envelopes, and they'd hand you an 8-ounce coke, and that was like a huge treat. And then he died, and then yeah, so that gave way, I guess, to about 1970, 71 when I started seeing writing appear on
Uh,
the trains.
okay. I'm going to cut you off for
Sure.
a second. So, what was it like growing up as a kid in Manhattan?
Growing up as a kid in Manhattan was crazy back then. I mean, it was just at least where we were because they had torn down most of the buildings on Columbus Avenue in a thing called urban renewal to stop so-called white flight, and it was also the time of the heroin epidemic, so you had that. There was this guy named Charlie Chopoff who was running around castrating kids and then killing them, and that was on less than 10 blocks away from where we were. But it was also a time where your parents didn't walk you to school. I mean, I was walking to school when I was 5 years old. They didn't, it was the last of what's called stoop culture in New York, which goes all the way back to the Dutch. When the Dutch settled New York, because the Dutch had water problems, they built stoops. So the stoops would rise up and the people would sit on the stoops, and you were taken care of by those people. So if you're a kid growing up on 94th Street as I was, the people who looked out for me were people on the stoops. And then that culture kind of faded away by the end of the 70s.
Okay. What type of things were you into as a kid in the 80s?
In the 80s, I wasn't a kid then.
Oh, you was
No,
or
I
in
would
the
have been
sev-
20 in 1980.
or in the 70s?
In the 1970s, I think my brain was focused on two things: comic books, comic art, I should also say, and writing graffiti. Those were the two things. Literally, I was obsessed with both of them, and they kind of overlapped a little bit. It allowed me to meet, for example, Vaughn Bode, who would eventually become celebrated on the sides of subways.
Oh, nice.
So I even have a photo of myself with Vaughn back in 1974.
Okay. Was you into art growing up in school?
I was not into art in school because they didn't have art programs. The city had no money. We were about to go bankrupt in 1974, so we didn't have art. It just didn't happen. I was self-motivated. My parents nurtured it. They were really, excuse me, let me try that again. Back in the 70s, we didn't have art programs in school. We didn't have after-school programs. We didn't have sports. We didn't have any of that because the city couldn't afford it. I was lucky in that my parents recognized that I had a talent, and they nurtured it. They were the ones who they were always happy to see me drawing and painting.
Okay. What age did you first start noticing writing on the walls or on the subway?
When I was about 10 years old, I saw the first tags on. It used to be you had vending machines in the subway, which you don't. They took them out in '73, but there would be these little black magic marker tags, and I'm sure some of them were Prey, some of them were Tacky 183, and then there were just a flood of names that followed. Those names eventually jumped to the subway tiles, and then eventually to the side of to the inside of the train, and then finally to the outside of the train by '72 or so.
Okay. Do you remember some of the early names that you seen on the walls or the trains at this time?
Well, the funny thing is I know that, for example, I know that I'm supposed to have seen Tacky 183, but I don't remember. So the two standouts for me, and it's just a few years apart, really, 1972. Snake One was a guy I remembered really well, and Stay High 149, of course, he was really gaining steam in 1972, and by 1973, when I was 12, he was everywhere.
Is that what inspired you to venture off into this life of crime, so to speak? Because at this time, it wasn't as accepted as it is now.
I would think the things that inspired me to write were, for me, it was one of those things. I was in junior high school, and it was something that I could do. In other words, I wasn't afraid to go on the tracks. I wasn't afraid to, I could run really fast. So while I had my parents to fear, it was something I could do that could separate me from all the other kids. So, they could look and say, oh, there's that guy who does that crazy stuff. He jumps on train tracks and stuff. And I think when you're a teenager, there are probably 10 kids in each school that want that and are willing to do that. But my parents really kept me on lock in terms of getting too crazy. So I didn't have the career that some of my counterparts had at that age.
Okay. What year did you officially start writing?
I started writing in 74. It seemed like the whole Upper West Side started writing in 74. You had guys like Hayes and Bill Rock and people like that. We all emerged out of the same group. And then I stopped in 75. I wound up going to music and art high school, and that changed my trajectory for a while. I was highly competitive there. And then I came back to writing in 1979, and that's when I took on the name Freedom. And then in 1980, I found the Freedom Tunnel.
Okay. So you started off writing Gem 2. How did you come up with that?
So my first tag was actually Genesis 2, which came from a really bad 1974 science fiction movie that was made for TV. And I quickly found that it was too long a name, so I shortened it to Gen 2 and didn't get it up that much. But I got to meet a lot of writers, and that would prove helpful years down the line.
Okay, so did you have a mentor, or were you going at this thing solo?
If I had a mentor back in the mid-'70s, I would say it was Stan 153, but more for art than for writing, because Stan had already finished his writing career, and we used to be at this graffiti workshop called N.O.G.A, Nation of Graffiti Artists, and Stan, who was this big hulking kind of figure, and me, I was like 2 feet tall at the time. But he recognized an artistic side to me that was different than the graffiti side, and he nurtured that. As for writing, it was just whoever you found, basically. I had friends who wrote, and so I wrote with them.
Okay. As a kid, how were you getting your paint? Were you telling mom and pops to buy you paint, or were you racking it?
Yeah, that's part of the problem with my writing career is that I didn't steal my paint. And I didn't steal markers, and I didn't. I had a grandfather who was a cop, so the idea of it's like in my brain I could rationalize writing, but if I got caught, I could rationalize it with my parents. But the idea of stealing something, like especially to my mom, it was her dad who was the cop. There was this sort of moral thing that I couldn't do. And I knew a number of other writers like that. And everybody bragged about stealing paint, but I would say, maybe half of them did. I know this, when I worked on the Stay High book years later, Stay High used to tell me that guys would come to him and give him money for mini wides, because he was 23 years old. So he would take like $200 and he would go down to Pearl Paints. And so for everyone that they gave him money for themselves, he made them give him money for one for himself. So, he would get like 20 mini wides, and then he would get the other 20 for them and hand them out. So he wasn't stealing his markers either, which makes me feel a little better.
Okay. Who was the first person you met when you first started writing, and how did y'all meet?
I would say the first big writer I met was Malta, who wrote with Steve 161, and Malta had this unbelievable tag that was like a swirl. He didn't get up that much, but he was an Upper West Side writer, and he was there in 1973, and he was stylistically terrific. And he doesn't have much of a memory of it, but we became friends much later, years later.
Okay. So how long after you dropped the name Gen 2 did you start writing Freedom?
So yeah, after I quit writing in '75 as Gen 2, then I went off to Music and Art High School, and then when I came back in '79, I hadn't even intended to write. I mean, I was done with that. I was working at the New York Times at that point. I was 18, 19 years old, and I found some spray paint. Literally found some spray paint. Didn't That's not a metaphor for stealing it. And I just decided to do this piece on a school across the street that said "Freedom to Write." I'm sorry, "Freedom to Learn." That was it. And then I started doing these messages around the neighborhood, and then I did the "Freedom to Write" piece. And then I realized, all right, I like this. I'm enjoying it, but I have to cut it down. So then I started doing freedom pieces. And then at that same time, I hooked up with Chris 217, who was already just crushing the Broadway line. And he became my partner, and then that was it. I kind of started my writing career again.
Okay. So how did you come up with the name Freedom?
So coming up with the name Freedom was, again, it was part of a messaging thing. At the time in the city, there were two guys. Well, there was Al Diaz and Jean-Michel Basquiat, and they were writing slogans on the Lower East Side. And then on the Upper West Side, there was Ali, who was the head of the soul artists, and he was also kind of writing his own slogans. And he knew Al and Jean-Michel, and I think that's where I picked up the sloganeering from. But again, it was a very short, brief, 2-week period, and then I dropped that, and then just got left with Freedom.
Okay. Okay. Makes sense. So were you in high school when you first started writing? And if so, what high school did you go to? And who are some of the artists that went to your school?
Well, there were two big writing schools in the city. There was Art and Design High School and Music and Art High School, and you had to try out to get into each of them. I made it into both. I chose to go to Music and Art. But I was already done writing. But Butch, too, went there, and I got to know Butch, and he was kind of a legendary figure. But I didn't really write in high school. And then I ran away from home and dropped out of high school and was kind of on the streets for a while. And all the while I was working at the New York Times, so then I kind of doubled my hours at the New York Times. And then that's kind of when I started writing again.
Okay. Was you ever down with any crews? And if so, what crews?
Well, my brother had a crew called the Acid Writers, and then he had stopped writing, and so I took that up, and then but I very quickly gave it to Chris 217 because I found that being like a 20-year-old adult walking down the street and having little 14-year-old kids, kind of waddling behind you going, yo, put me down. It's like kind of just not my thing. But I was in a whole bunch of crews, too many to write, And a lot of them I didn't even write with. They were guys that I knew and hung out with. So, I mean, I was very lucky. I got put in the Ex-Vandals in 1979 because I knew Bama and I knew Wicked Gary and I knew those guys. But to me, that's an honorary thing because to me, the real Ex-Vandals, if you weren't in it from 71 to 73, then it's just more of an honorary thing. It's not, you're not really down. But you know what? Everybody's different with that, and if people are getting put in the Ex-Vandals to this day around the world, all the more power to them. I don't mean to, denigrate it or anything like that. My own feeling was if you weren't there for 71 to 73, you missed it.
Yeah. Okay. Did you ever go to the bench at 149th Street? And who were some of the artists you would always see up there?
I did go to the bench at 149th. I may be one of the few people who didn't see writers there because I would go there at like 5 in the morning, and specifically because I didn't want to see writers. I was very, very cautious about everything I did in the subway system. Yeah, meeting new writers on those terms, on their turf, I didn't want to do that.
Okay. Who were some of the popular writers from your era?
Oh, the it depends which there's the era from when I first started writing, 74 and 75. Then there's that era of 79 and 80. 1980, by the way, I think may have been the greatest year for graffiti because I think that some of the greatest writers had reached their peak, guys like Dondi and NOC167, people like that. But there are just too many writers to name. So I'll throw out a few names that inspired me at least. I still think NOC167, pound for pound, was the best stylist ever. Big fan of Billy 167 as well. Stay High 149. It was an honor years later to meet him and eventually go on to write his biography of his life. Those guys all inspired me, but the list is vast.
Okay. What was your peak years on the subway?
I had no peak years on the subway. Yeah, if I was to sit here and say, yo, I was a legend, that would just be a lie. I did maybe 30 pieces, most of them silver and black. A guy like Scene could have done what I did in one night. And I'm not just being humble. I just would go. I would go with Chris 217, and he would go and bomb trains, and I would do like a silver and black piece. And the problem was that didn't really have enough color paint and didn't have enough, guys like Zephyr, Dondi, people like that. They were willing to fail in order to get better and better. And I wasn't, so I kept doing the same silver and black bubbly thing that nobody cared about and meant nothing in the world of writing. And then the only thing that was different was that I started to add, by standing further away and closer to it, I could get gray tones. And once I could get gray tones, then I realized I could actually draw on a train. I could do a portrait, I could do something. And then that culminated in me painting the Sistine ceiling on the side of a train in 1983. So that was the only train I did of any importance. The rest of it was just.
Okay. What was your favorite line to hit back in the day?
Back then, I almost only hit the one line. I hit the sevens a few times. I hit the ones at a few different locations. But yeah, probably the sevens and the ones. But mostly, literally the ones.
Okay. Did you king any lines?
I never kinged a line. I mean, I never kinged a subway car. So let's get this stuff into perspective. Sadly, it's not what I'm known for. I mean, look, I'm thrilled that I had that experience to go into the one tunnel at the height of its, gangs going through and RTW and TDS and those guys. But their work is so high up there, and my work was so down low that, it's just not what I'm famous for. But I was there, and I went through some of the same things they went through. And so, we'll always have that connection.
Okay. Do you have any writing partners? And if so, who was it and how did y'all meet?
Chris 217 would have been my one writing partner. I trusted him with my life. And he got me in and out of the one tunnel so many times. And I will say also the Spanish Five, those guys, Stan and most notably Stan. Stan was a good friend of mine. This is not Stan 153. This was Stan 1 from the Spanish Five. And those guys had a brief window where they had the one tunnel on lock, and they could get you in and out. And that's how I got to paint the train in '83, the Sistine ceiling, because of those guys, because they had a ladder and everything else.
Okay. Who was your biggest rivalry on the subway?
I had no rivalry
rivalry?
on the subway. No, yeah.
Or was there anybody that you wanted to test your skills against to, I guess, compete, like to see if, I guess, y'all was on the same level, or anybody you aspired to paint with at that time?
I think it's always an honor when you get to paint with somebody that you admire. So I was incredibly lucky. I knew Tracy 168, and eventually I got to paint with him, almost as a fluke by accident. So that was probably the biggest name writer that I ever wrote with. But actually, yeah, that's about all I got.
Okay. Is there any people you think deserve acknowledgement that normally don't get mentioned and that deserve props?
I think in writing it as a graffiti historian who's written a number of books and done documentaries and so on and so forth, you can't list everybody, and you make these top 10 lists, then they go to top 20 lists and top 50 lists. And I think you try and find people that transcended the culture. So I'll give you an example. When I went to Music and Art, I hung out with these guys, hung out with the Cisco kid, another guy named Stedroy, and they didn't write. They weren't into writing at all, although Cisco would wind up being a pivotal force in the hip-hop world. But we would do these drawings of like comic heroes and stuff like that, and there would be a wall in the background, and both of them would do Stay High 149 tags. So I would, when I first met them, I was like, well, you guys write? You guys write? And they're like, no. So that's what I mean by transcendent. They, like, Stay High was so ubiquitous at the time, and wanting to learn how to do his tag was so important for anybody involved in the arts, or in wanting to appear to be involved in the streets or whatever. So that's what makes a guy like Stay High transcendent. That's what makes a Tacky 183 transcendent. He's, the first guy to go all city. So, but there are 100 other guys behind him, and then if you don't list those 100 guys, then they don't really get a nod. Like Joe 182 was 2 steps behind Tacky 183, and he's rarely written about. The same thing with Dino Nod from the Ex-Vandals. As you get later, things square up a little bit, because when Subway Art comes out in '83, that's a pretty fair representation of what was going on the trains. The only problem is the photographers who documented the movement didn't document the IND trains and the BMT trains. And those train lines have their own history to them.
Is that like the Brooklyn, the stuff
Yeah.
that's coming from Brooklyn and stuff like that?
Exactly.
Okay.
But they also had their own, like the INDs were primarily ridges, so they had ridges on them. So only a number of people like that would hit them, because you couldn't really make art on them. So they were throw up lines, and then it comes down to how much credit do you want to give to a guy who did 10,000 throw ups versus a guy who did 50 really crisp burners. Because frankly, throw-ups can be done by anybody. Mm-hmm. And there's always going to be that debate. So a guy like Dean, for example, who wrote KO, gets no credit. I mean, and he did thousands of KO throw-ups. The Top crew,
The
people,
partner?
yeah, James Top, those guys, they were up on all the lines. And for them, that was the height of writing, the epitome of writing, was hitting 19, 20 different lines. So would you rather, and to other guys, it was yo, I did my 50 burners, I'm out, and who's right, who's wrong. So like Top Crew gets overlooked, although now James has his book out, which is great. But because we tend to photograph the IRT lines and burners, and they seem to take precedent over throw-ups. And then there are some guys like Jester who did all of it. So a guy like Jester had like one of the greatest tags ever, had a million throw-ups on all the different lines, and also did window down burners. So I like well-rounded figures like that. But yeah, I think anybody, there's enough information out there online and in books that I don't feel anybody's getting that overlooked.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we come to the section of the interview where I ask you like to pick them, basically, like pitting two artists together and who you think would win in a battle. So first off, we got T-Kid versus Bates from Europe.
T-Kid versus Bates from Europe.
Yeah.
Well, it's unfair, and I'll tell you why. T-Kid's importance in the New York City subway movement cannot be overlooked. So he's one of the most pivotal writers, wrote in the 70s, wrote in the 80s, helped make the transition to walls. So, it is possible that Bates has a lot more different styles, or as Scene likes to call them, fonts and stuff like that. But in terms of relevance and importance, I take T-Kid any day.
Oh, okay.
But I'm always going to be New York centric.
Yeah. This is basically style versus style. Okay. The next one we got Cess versus Totem 2.
I got to go Cess.
Cess. Okay. Third on the list we got Bio versus Ski.
Oh, Bio. Bio is brilliant.
Okay. On the up next we have Revoke versus Purr.
Revoke versus Purr. I don't have an opinion on that one.
Okay. Moving on, we have Mad C versus Dime.
Who? What?
Mad C versus Dime.
Don't even know.
Oh,
Next.
okay. Gore versus Bacon.
All right. Here's something that we need to. I'm 63.
Oh. Okay.
Okay? It is very hard. I barely know anything from 1980 to 1990.
Okay, I got
it's
you.
all 70s stuff for me. And but I meant what I said about T-Kid.
Yeah, for sure.
He is incredibly important.
Okay, the last one we have Pose 2 versus Mode 2.
Oh, I like Mode.
Mode 2. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And that's more of a personal taste.
Yeah, for sure.
I like
all
him
this
as a person,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
an artist. I like everything about him.
All right. Well, that concludes this interview. I wanted to thank you for sitting down here and chatting it up with me, and taking the time out. Do you want to say any thank yous or last words to anyone? Family or friends?
Just don't get arrested. I mean, that's about it. And I think we were talking about this a minute ago, which is that it is very hard for people of my generation and my age. Like, I'll give you an example. In the 1970s, there was a resurgence of the 1950s, which is how Happy Days came on TV. And we would look at it and be like, man, the 1950s, damn, that's crazy. That's so ancient, and their whole culture, their whole fashion in the 1950s. It's so. And now I think about it, and I think there are like 20-year-old kids getting into the movement, and I'm 43 years removed from that. So, they would be thinking, oh my God, to them, the 1960s is like the 1920s to me. So I think that people my age tend to lose that perspective, and that's something that we can bring to the table. There are much better people to tell you you know, who is a better writer out of these contemporary guys than me.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
But I can tell you who the first writer was, and I can tell you who handed the marker to Tacky and said, "Hey, kid, why don't you write your name?" So that's that's my place in history.
Oh, nice. All right. Well, thanks again. Freedom.
Happy to be here.
Peace.
Peace.